Hello, this is the third lesson in the music half of our fine arts class. It is the elements of music. And just a reminder before we get started that you should be writing down all this information in your notebook, excuse me, so that you can have it to look at in class to use for all of our in-class activities and stuff like that. So make sure to, pause, rewind as much as you need so you can get all the information down. Remember, there are some things that I'm going to say that aren't necessarily on the slides, so make sure that you get those things as well. So let's get started. So when we're listening to music, we were talking about a lot about listening to music so far. It helps to focus on one thing at a time. There's a lot to listen for, especially for someone that's not practiced in listening to music in a sort of musical way. So what we're doing here is breaking down the elements, breaking down music into 10 distinct different elements. And all types of music have all types of these elements. Doesn't matter what style it is, doesn't matter if you listen to dubstep or classical music or rap or pop or whatever. They all have these 10 elements in some way or another. And so by breaking them down like that, hopefully you can focus your listening in on very specific things and get a little more out of it. So, what are the 10 elements of music? They are rhythm, melody, harmony, timbre, texture, form, pitch, dynamics, articulation, and lyrics. And I would like you to remember them in this order. And to help you remember them in this order, came up with an acronym, and it is Really Magical Highway Turkey Tacos Fix People's Driving Accident Luck. It's kind of a mouthful, I guess, but hopefully it will help you remember at least the first letter of each one of the elements of music. So we're going to talk about each 10 of these just for a few minutes, and then later as the class goes on, we'll get into them more in depth. But let's get started with rhythm. Number one. So rhythm is the organization of time in music. So it's how we divide up time. Is it even? Is it odd? What kind of meter do you hear? Can you feel the beat? Can you tap your toe to the beat? Can you identify what the beat is? Is it slow? Can you describe it? Fast, slow, medium? Does it speed up? Does it slow down? Does it speed up and then slow down? Lots of different ways to think of rhythm that we're going to get into, but just on a basic level, rhythm means the organization of time in music. Number two is melody. It's probably the most easily recognizable of the elements. It is, the fancy definition is that it's a series of pitches that form a cohesive musical line. It's the main tune that stands out. If you're listening to your favorite song on your iPod or on your computer or whatever, and then later you're walking down the street and you're humming that song to yourself, you're probably humming the melody. So melody is that thing that stands out as the tune. Something to consider with melody is that there's the primary melody, usually in a piece of music, but there are almost always other melodies that are going on. So what do they sound like? How do they sort of interplay with the primary melody, and how does that affect the piece of music as a whole? So there you go, melody. Number three is one that works very closely with melody. It's harmony. So harmony are sounds that provide support and enrichment for the melody. It accompanies the melody. You can use lots of different words to describe it. There are lots of different kinds of harmonies. For now, the two that I want you to be aware of, two that I want you to know about, are major, which is generally happy sounding harmonies, and minor, which are generally sad sounding harmonies. There are lots of other different ones, but for the purposes of this class for now, until we get into harmony more in depth later, I want you to know that major means happy and minor means sad. So make sure that you can understand that and remember that one. It's an important thing. Okay, timbre is the next one. And yes, that's how it's pronounced. It's timbre, even though it has an I. That's just one of those funny words. It's the distinct sound of every instrument or voice. So every person, of course, has a unique voice. Even people that have very similar voices, they're different just a little bit. And that's what timbre means, is that sort of uniqueness in an instrument or a voice. This one, timbre, is also known as tone color. They're the same thing. You might hear me on these videos referring to timbre or referring to tone color. That's the same thing. Timbre equals tone color, so just make sure you don't get confused about that. They both mean the distinct individual sound of each instrument or voice. So when you're listening to music, listen for timbre. Think of, how would you describe the individual unique sound of the voice or instrument that you're hearing? Is it harsh, smooth, mellow, rough, deep, shrill? There are lots of different words you could use. So just focus on one instrument or voice and think about the sort of unique character of that and try to describe it. So number 5, texture, has a lot to do with timbre because it is the combinations of timbres sounding together. Okay. So what kind of group do you hear is a question to think about for texture. So you can think about if you hear 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, you can tell that you're hearing the texture of a string quartet, for example. If you hear trumpets, trombones, saxophones, piano, bass, drums, piano, and guitar, you're probably hearing a jazz band. Not necessarily, but it depends on what style of music they're playing. But anyhow, there are lots of different textural combinations, and those are just sort of the blends of all the different timbres together and what you hear. So remember, the texture is sort of fluid. Usually in a piece of music, you don't have the same people singing or playing the whole time. Usually people will have to breathe or stop for at least for a few seconds every now and then. So texture is kind of a fluid, constantly changing thing. But it's that interesting blend of timbres that create nice sounds. So, all right, moving on. 6 is form. Form is probably what you're thinking it is. It's the purposeful arrangement of events in a composition, the general shape of a piece. So form is thinking long term, okay, thinking long term, thinking of the whole piece, thinking of the entire 3-minute pop song, or thinking of the entire 40-minute symphony, or thinking of the entire 15-minute concerto, or whatever. Thinking of how that whole thing, that whole big complete piece of music is organized. And on a more basic level, we're talking about is musical material repeated? So, and if it is repeated, which usually there's some repetition, how is it repeated, and when, and how often, and all those kinds of things. So we're going to talk about different forms in this class. For example, verse chorus form, rondo form, blues form, through composed ternary form. There are lots of different ones. So you can begin to identify sort of the framework of each piece of music that the composer or musicians are working with. Pitch, I've alluded to earlier, relates a lot to melody. Pitch just means the relative position, the highness or lowness of a musical sound. So there are really high notes and there are really low notes. So there are all kinds of different pitches, and there are ones in between. It's similar, like I said, to melody, but it's a little more general, just referring to specific notes. A pitch is also what most people think of as a note in a sort of basic sense. So something to think about with pitch: which instruments play high pitches, which ones play low pitches. As you learn more about the instruments, you'll know which ones are high pitched and which ones are low pitched. But so think about that. Are the high pitched instruments trying to play low, maybe, or are the low pitched instruments trying to play high? There are lots of different ways that composers and musicians sort of mess around with our ideas of pitch to create different timbres and interesting sounds as well. So what combinations of sounds do you hear? Do you generally maybe hear high pitches in a piece of music? Do you generally hear low pitches? I would suggest that most pieces of music, generally speaking, are a mix of high and low, but not necessarily. So that's something to think about. Okay, number 8, dynamics. Dynamics is the fancy musical word that we use to talk about volume. So the loud and soft. How loud is the music, or how soft is the music, or somewhere in between. Okay. and that means how loud does it start, how loud does it end, and everything in the middle. Right? There are lots of millions of different ways of how dynamics work. You could think about dynamics in a really couple of seconds. Does it start loud and get soft? Does it start soft and get loud? Or you could think of it in sort of a long-term way. Does the piece start soft and gradually over 3, 5, 10, 20, 40 minutes get louder, or the opposite? Lots of different ways to think about it. There are lots of fancy musical words that we use to describe volume, the dynamics in music. Things like forte, mezzo, piano, piano, pianissimo, that kind of thing. And for now, I just want you to know that dynamics means volume, the loud and soft in music. All right, almost there. Number 9 is articulation. Articulation is very similar to the way that we think of articulation in speech. It's how individual notes begin and end, how articulate the musicians are playing or singing. So an easy way to think of that, I think, is if you're listening to a piece of music, do the notes blend together? So are they la, 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 or are they maybe detached and there's a space in between there? La, 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 la. So, there are lots of different ways to begin the note and end the note. Is it a harsh, intense, loud beginning of a note? Is it a soft beginning of the note? How does the note end? So articulation is sort of thinking on a much smaller scale and thinking about individual notes, but it's really the detail that brings any piece of music to life is the articulation in the lyrics that someone sings maybe, or in the notes that are played by any of the musicians in a piece. And then the last one is lyrics. And lyrics is pretty self-explanatory, words that are spoken or sung in a piece of music. It's important to remember not all music has lyrics. Seems kind of obvious to point out, I guess, but I think a lot of people, past students that I've had and things, are so used to listening to music that has lyrics all the time that it's easy to forget that. And also remember that lyrics are not always in English. There's lots of music that's been written over the centuries that's not in English. So if it's not in English, try and figure out what language it is. If you can, try and get your hands on a translation of some kind, or put it in a Google Translate or something like that and figure it out. And then, of course, think of how all of those other elements fit in with the lyrics. So if it's telling a story of some kind, or maybe some sort of poetic statement, maybe think of how all the other elements reflect that poetic statement or that story or whatever it is. And then another thing, of course, to think about with lyrics, are they spoken or sung? So are they spoken like in rap typically is, or are they sung like maybe an opera aria or a pop song or something like that? So lots of different ways to think about lyrics. So that's the 10 elements of music: rhythm, melody, harmony, timbre, texture, form, pitch, dynamics, articulation, and lyrics. And that acronym, again, to help you remember, is really magical: highway, turkey, tacos, fixed people's driving, accident, luck. So that's the 10 elements of music. Remember that no matter what style of music you're listening to, they all include these 10 elements, no matter what. They're just changed, manipulated by the composers of the music and by the performers of the music to make an individual piece. So we'll talk about these more in detail as we go on, but for now, that's the end. So I will see you next time.